the subject is more complex than it looks, right? And so I'm going to give you a model that you can bust any myth. Anytime somebody gives gyan, you can say, okay, let me really think about that and break it down and get a wider perspective of this. This is a model that's called reflective equilibrium. It was made by a philosopher called John Rawls, and it'll bust any myth. So here are the steps. Let me explain the steps first, and I'll give you an example of how to apply it. So, for example, the first one is when you hear a statement that sounds right, that sounds great, that sounds wise, okay? The first thing you want to do is ask yourself, in which situation would this statement be false? Where would the statement fail? The second thing you say is, think of a modified statement that would actually work in that situation, that would actually be true in this situation, right? Then you say, okay, where would this modified situation not be true? The statement would be false. And keep repeating that process until you feel like you've seen the bigger picture, and then finally make a decision. Let me give you an example of this, right? So say you hear somebody saying something like, oh, honesty is the best policy. And that sounds great. Yeah, no, wow, honesty is the best policy. Yeah, fantastic. I need to do that, right? But in which situation would that be false? If a terrorist was holding a gun and saying, where's your brother hiding? Would you always be honest? If your neighbor calls you up and says, oh, my son is getting married, please come for the wedding, would you say, I'm sorry, I really don't like your son that much, I'm not going to go to the wedding? Probably not. So which situation? So you can imagine, there's some situations where there are things that are more important than honesty, okay? But in general, I want to be honest with myself, maybe, right? But then you say, are there situations where even that modified statement would be false, where it makes sense to lie to myself? And you see, there are. Sometimes you might have such a traumatic event in your childhood that you're just not ready to face it. Okay, so let me lie to myself until I'm ready to face it. Maybe that's true, right? And so you keep going, and the phrase becomes more and complex. And then when you finally see the complexity, then you make a decision. Right? And so if you follow this process, you'll see that the opposite of any truth is also true. And this is what I want to leave you with, right? The good managers know the right answer, and great managers know in which situation the right answer is wrong, right? And that's a process that 5 steps in enlighten. And here's the question I have for you guys to think about before I wrap this up, right? 1, what are your great truths? 3 truths that you're like, I really believe that. That's like my life is lived around that. 2, what would be the opposite of those great truths? Because they're also true. Now, I'm not saying if you say, family is the most important thing, the opposite of that is not necessarily family is unimportant, let me sell them to slavery, right? The opposite of that might be, it's important for me to spend time on myself. It might be that that's the opposite for you, right? So what are the opposite of those 3 great truths that you live your life by? And the third question is, if you could see that both of these are true, both of these perspectives are true, what would that open up in your life? I'll leave you with those questions. Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope I've thoroughly confused you, because you see, the aim of this talk was not to give clarity. It's not simple, it's more complex. And confusion really tells you that you're saying, I now appreciate the complexity, right? So anytime you're feeling confusion, don't resist it, don't fight it, because you'll then simplify and not see the complexity. Enjoy the confusion, because you're about to make a decision about your values when you realize it's more complex. And in that, you're defining yourselves. Thank you very much.